Hi, and welcome to another Charter Cities Institute Research Q&A video. My name is Jeffrey Mason. I'm a research associate here at the Charter Cities Institute, and joining me today is Professor Alex Rothenberg. He's a professor of economics at Syracuse University, and the topic of our discussion today is urban sprawl and its effect on measures of social capital. So, Professor Rothenberg, take it away.
Okay, great. Yeah, so thanks so much for organizing this. I think you guys are doing really interesting work at Charter Cities Institute. So this paper is kind of joint work with some co-authors at the University of Arkansas. So Arya Gaddu, who I've worked with on a number of projects, and Andrea Civelli, and as well as Yao Wang, who is a PhD student in our department. Over the last several decades, developing countries have seen a massive increase in urbanization. Between 2018 and 2050, Africa's urban population is expected to triple. And at the same time, many cities in developing countries are also sprawling or kind of expanding spatially. So there's a nice paper by Angel et al., Shlomo Angel at NYU, who finds that cities are basically expanding at roughly 2 times their population growth rates. As sprawl has occurred in kind of developed countries, there has been a lot of concern that this sort of low density development that comes from urban sprawl may adversely impact kind of social capital in those communities. The new housing that's being provided in peripheral areas of cities, this is leading to kind of increased sorting, and this may weaken kind of a nation's imagined community. It might increase political polarization. So there's a lot of work that's arguing that in many kind of burgeoning democracies, the political polarization is increasing, and there's an extent to which, so Bill Bishop's work on kind of the big sort is arguing that basically people are kind of living further apart from, people with diverse backgrounds, and this is leading to more polarization. And if we're finding that low density reduces trust and community participation, then growth controls to mitigate these negative externalities to kind of force people to live in more compact settings, they might be justified potentially. But there's also other work that kind of argues that sprawl may instead improve social capital. So there's some early kind of sociological literature that sort of argues that urban life is too it's too mentally difficult to process all the interactions that you're taking place. There's more anonymous interactions, and so actually in lower density settings you're finding greater trust and community participation. And then some work in economics that's tried to look at this and finds that at least in U.S. cities, it seems to be the case that sprawl actually may improve social capital. But generally, the evidence is fairly mixed. What we know of tends to come from developed countries, and there's little that's known about this relationship in developing country cities. And this is important given how much urban development is having in developing countries, and kind of the nature of this spatial expansion is fairly large. So what we're going to do in this paper, and this is a working paper, so just looking forward to kind of getting some questions and feedback. We're going to basically use satellite data to construct some new measures of urban spatial extent and sprawl in Indonesian cities, and we're going to tie that to measures of social capital that we have from cities in Indonesia. So we have data from the 2012 National Socioeconomic Survey, the SUSANAS, that has really rich measures of trust, of community participation, and also interethnic kind of tolerance and cooperation. And we're combine that with census data, which we have actually at the unit level from 2000 and 2010. Our approach to estimating the effects of density on social capital is going to address 2 really crucial problems in causal inference. And these are problems that this literature has not done a good job of addressing. So the first problem is that there could be some simultaneity or kind of omitted place-based characteristics that could be correlated with density and improve social capital. And if we don't have a nice kind of shifter in density that's exogenous to some of these omitted characteristics, then the correlations that we observe may not be causal. And so what we're going to be using as a shifter for density is soil characteristics. So and measures of built-up areas in the like 1970s, before Indonesia's industrialization had really taken place. And the idea here is that the different properties of soil types in Indonesian area, like villages, those are going to influence settlement patterns historically, And cities will form, in particular places, but the sort of particular soil characteristics should not have any effect on social capital in those places today directly, because these places are now like parts of urban areas. The next problem is sorting. So when we see that some villages have are low dense, like less dense places that tend to be more ethnically homogeneous, we might be worried that basically the effects of density on social capital could be just due to the fact that particular types of individuals are sorting to different areas. And so what we're going to do in this paper is adapt a procedure that's been used in kind of the neighborhood effects literature to effectively control for sorting. So Altanji and Richard Mansfield, and I'll go over this in a bit more detail, they basically have a sorting model, and under certain conditions, controls for observable characteristics of neighborhood composition can control not only for kind of the observable sorting, but also sorting on unobservables. And so we're going to use a rich vector of like 37 demographic controls from the 2010 census to effectively control for sorting. Just in terms of previewing our results, we find that lower density communities tend to have increased trust in neighbors and greater community participation. So density actually causally increases trust in neighbors and increases, density weakens trust in neighbors and weakens community participation. And this actually echoes the findings of the US context. The effects are pretty similar with and without controls for sorting. We find that lower density is actually correlated with lower intergroup tolerance. So these suburban communities, they seem to have lower levels of intergroup tolerance, and that's a slightly worrying thing. There's a potential for these sort of ethnic enclaves that are emerging in the suburbs of major cities to be exacerbating interethnic cooperation that could have some of these like political polarization effects. But these effects are less robust as sorting controls, and so I think sorting is probably playing more of a role in these findings. Nevertheless, it's pretty interesting to see this, and I think when you think about local politics, particularly Indonesia's government, in certain elections, these types of forces could really matter in sort of who gets elected in particular places. And we're going to try to explore some of the mechanisms behind these findings. So I think the literature, the Robert Putnam idea is really that when people are spending all this time commuting, they have less time to give to their communities. We actually find that those sorts of opportunity costs stories don't seem to be playing a role in these findings. So the sort of individual differences across in terms of like people's abilities to participate, in terms of like whether or not they're married, whether or not they have children, whether or not they commute long distances by private modes. Those don't seem to be explaining the factors. What we do see some support for is just differences in citywide context. So cities that are very ethnically diverse, that have high crime rates, these relationships are intensified. And so I'm going to kind of omit the relationship to literature. I've got sort of described a bit of that already. So just as an outline of my talk, that was my intro. I'm going to describe the background and data, discuss identification, the kind of causal inference issues, and how we estimate these effects. Then I'll describe my results, and finally I will conclude. So this is a picture of Indonesia. The kind of red, the dark red areas correspond to areas with greater nighttime light intensity. This is from the NOAA's nighttime lights measures. And you can see Jakarta, Surabaya, major cities are very evident in this map. So Indonesia is the fourth most populous country in the world, about 230 million people as of 2010 census. In 1945, when it was first declared independent from the Dutch, it was not very urbanized. So only about an eighth of the population lived in towns and cities. But rapid urbanization kind of accompanied Indonesia's economic development. And today, about 151 million people, about 56% of the population lives in urban areas. That urbanization rate is expected to be about 70% by 2045. If you're interested, there's a great kind of report on urbanization in Indonesia by Mark Roberts and co-authors. It's called kind of Time to Act, Realizing Indonesia's Urban Potential. So a lot of great kind of information there. What's interesting about Indonesian urbanization is that relative to some countries in, say, like China, for instance, where rural to urban migration is really driving the changes in urbanization rate, most of the urbanization in Indonesia is actually reclassification. It's places that were formerly rural, but because cities have sprawled and expanded, like these places have become part of the urban, these urban fringe areas are kind of becoming urban. So reclassification explains roughly 80% of the growth in urbanization in Indonesia of this period. And this is the kind of inner islands of, this is Java, Bali. These are the most populous parts of the country, but there's still like massive urban settlements in, Medan and northern Sumatra, for example. This is a plot of data from the European Union's Joint Research Center. They produce, they basically combine a bunch of different sort of remote sensing satellite-based measures of population. So this includes like nighttime lights data. This includes Landsat measures of, and they so all these satellites have been flying, all over the planet, and they come up with estimates of each location's, built up propensity. So the extent to which kind of a pixel, in this case, this is a 250 by 250 meter pixel, so pretty low resolution. What share of that is like built up versus not built up? So it's an amazing kind of data exercise using machine learning, combining machine learning with lots of satellite imagery. And so this is a picture of Surabaya. So this is East Java. This is other cities in East Java in 1990. And what's nice about this is it's publicly available. It's free, and they have remotely sensed estimates from 1975, 1990, 2000, and 2014. So it's a really great data resource. In 1990, roughly 0.46% of Indonesia overall was built up. And this is the change from 1990 to 2014. I'll just kind of toggle that again, just a massive, growth in the built up spatial extent of cities. By 2014, the 0.75% of Indonesia was built up. So this is basically nearly doubling the sort of the built up extent of Indonesia. Is pretty amazing. So this is, East Java. East Java is a very, fast growing part of the Indonesian economy, but we still see, similar kind of growth effects. This is Pontianak, the capital of West Kalimantan, which is a smaller city, but you're still seeing, some pretty substantial growth, and also kind of, sprawl around kind of the road networks that you can kind of see as well. It's pretty evident. So what do we do with this GHL cell data? Well, we follow, there's a nice paper by Birchfield and co-authors in the QJE that measures kind of sprawl using satellite data. So we're going to kind of adapt those techniques to this context. And some important, outputs of that process of kind of quantifying cities and measuring sprawl is we kind of obtain the locations of the centroids of cities, so like the centroids of the urban cores, and we measure kind of the fringes of cities, like every location that's within 100 kilometers of all these urban cores. So we have about 72 different cities that we're looking at. So these are all cities that have populations of like more than 100,000 or more. It'd be nice to kind of expand this to a slightly larger sample, but that's what we're looking at today. We have, in 2010, there were 75,000 villages in Indonesia. And once you drop the, 53,000 villages that are kind of, rural, that are not part of these cities, you get about 21,000, urban communities. And these are both like, sort of kelurahan, which are kind of the actually formally part of cities versus, and also like the desa, the sort of villages that are surrounding these cities. But, so the process of classification of these settlements and these communities as desa and kelurahan is that's a political thing. And so our sort of, we think that our measures of, using satellite data really capture kind of the economic definitions of what these cities are. So I'm going to combine the satellite data with measures of social capital from the National Socioeconomic Survey. So We have 5 measures of like trust in neighbors. So do you trust your neighbors to watch your house, to watch your child if there's no adult in your home? There's also measures of community trust and participation. So the extent to which you communicate, you usually participate in community activities, religious activities, volunteering for your neighborhood, safety. Do you think that the religious leaders act as good role models, for example? And then 5 measures of kind of intergroup tolerance. So how happy you are with the activities of other groups in your neighborhood. Are you aware of other groups that live in your neighborhood? And do you agree that the mayor or the governor must be like a native Indonesian? So these are kind of all different proxies that measure various aspects of social capital. So this all come from the 2012 socio capital model of the Susannahs. And we're going to group outcomes in our analysis because these are all kind of similar measures that are all kind of like, trying to measure some aspects of the same thing. So we're going to kind of use an econometric strategy called mean effects analysis that lets us, estimate the effective density on the sort of overall index of these measures. We'll combine this with census data. So Indonesia is a great country to work in from a data perspective. We have data from Harvard's library actually that they have data on the 2000 and 2010 census. So basically like unit level census data geocoded with block and building code information. This provides lots of demographic characteristics. It provides us with a way of measuring ethnic diversity, religious diversity, and also segregation, the extent to which different ethnic and religious groups are living kind of together within a city or within a smaller spatial unit. Finally, we can measure a lot of things with GIS data. So measures of agroclimatic, sort of terrain cover, elevation, ruggedness. These are all, easily obtained, digital elevation maps and so forth. Measures of distance to the coast, and also, the sort of, Badan Pusat statistic. The Indonesian government has nicely provided village level shape files, these polygons that we can use to kind of tie everything together. So one thing that we looked at just, for starters, this is what I'm doing is across all cities, looking at population density on the y-axis and distance to the kind of core central business districts on the x-axis. So, locations over here are close to the central business district in a city. Locations over here are kind of 20 to 30 kilometers in the suburbs. And we're finding that basically density increases as distance to density declines as distance to the central business district increases. This is exactly what you would expect. You see this basically in every city on planet Earth. What we also look at is ethnic fractionalization at distance to the CBD. So ethnic fractionalization, I'm actually plotting this thing called F, which is a measure of the probability that two residents of a community belong to different ethnic groups. So if you draw 2 people randomly, what's the probability that they don't belong to the same group? So as this measure goes higher, the community gets more diverse. And so, Indonesia's, a hugely ethnically diverse country with 1,000 different ethnicities, 700 different languages. But most Indonesians kind of live in roughly homogeneous villages. So the national fractionalization index is about 0.7. But the median village has an F of about 0.05. So that's mostly kind of rural, Indonesia. And we see that the F is declining as distance to the central business district increases. And so, sorting is really potentially concerning, right? So, if these are the places where we're seeing, lower interethnic tolerance, is that because there is a true kind of effect of density on kind of interethnic tolerance, or is it just because the people that live in these lower density communities that maybe just are less, they're less tolerant to begin with, or kind of, more racist or something? So and here I'm plotting kind of ethnic segregation and sprawl. So this ethnic segregation index on the y-axis is a multi-group segregation measure. So Indonesia has multiple groups, so we can't use the sort of standard, black-white segregation measures like the isolation index or something that you'd see in the US context. And we're plotting this against sprawl between 2000 and 2014. And what we're seeing is that more rapidly sprawling cities, over this period had a larger ethnic segregation index. again, this is all correlational, but I think this again just highlights the need to really address sorting and estimating these effects. Okay, so let's jump to identification and estimation. So what I would like to do is estimate the relationship between density and a social capital outcome. So here, C is going to index communities, I is going to index individuals. I'm going to have a city-specific intercept or a city fixed effect, and then that community's log density. So beta is kind of the parameter of interest. It's going to measure the impact of density on social capital, and then I'm going to control for observable characteristics of that individual with this vector xi, which includes age, age squared, gender, education, marital status, employment status, etc. I'm concerned, and epsilon is an error term. So I'm concerned about simultaneity, that there might be omitted place-based characteristics that are correlated with density and epsilon. And I'm also concerned about sorting, that like unobserved taste or cost for contributing to social capital can induce some correlation between epsilon and log density.
Could you give an example of what one of those omitted characteristics might be?
Yeah, so maybe a place. So one thing we try to do is to control for a lot of characteristics. So if you think that like less rugged places it's easier for you to produce social capital. So places that are less mountainous, it's easier to talk to your neighbors because you're not traveling up and down mountains or for something. So that'd be one reason. And then, less mountainous places tend to have greater density. So it's not that we're estimating the effect of density; it's the effect of like it being mountainous or something. So that's why we try to control for a lot of things. But so that's one. It could also be unobservable aspects of the particular soils that it's easier to grow crops or something that's more favorable. That's why so we're using like that soil quality to shift around density. It's like some things like that. So does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, great. So in order to deal with this simultaneity concern, we are going to use soil characteristics as instrumental variables. So soil grids is a nice publicly available data set, again, measured at this 250 meter resolution. We're going to use measures of like the bulk density of soil, the sand content of the soils, clay content, texture, water content, and soil taxonomy information. We're going to try to measure all these things at really low depths. So what soil grids does is it compiles a bunch of different soil samples across the globe, and it also does some machine learning to kind of smooth some of this out and provide these like estimates of the soil type and these different soil characteristics for different locations, basically for everywhere on the planet. And in order for these to be useful instruments, the idea is that these sort of like these measures should reflect sort of stable, fertile soils that attracted density historically, but they don't impact social capital today. So we're going to be really, a violation of this exclusion restriction would be for these places to be agricultural places today, and so these are places, right? So we're going to be basically restricting the sample to non-agricultural households, dropping places where there's large shares of agricultural employment still, even though these areas are more built up. So this is like the kinds of things we're worried about. We're also going to be using lagged measures of density from kind of the 1975 built up areas, so before Indonesia's industrialization. So for the GHSL data, this is all based on Landsat estimates of Landsat 1. Landsat 1 has some problems. So it actually, like a lot of Sumatra and parts of Jakarta are not covered in this data set because of cloud cover over the period when Landsat was coming. So it's a kind of unfortunate. So we kind of lose a big chunk of our sample. But the exclusion restriction here is that we need some spatial persistence in the distribution of the population, but the like kind of local drivers of social capital are going to be different today from what they were in the 1970s. That's a bit less credible potentially than the soil characteristics data. So we're going to hopefully these effects are going to be robust across these different instruments. A third instrument I won't talk a whole lot about is basically a 10-year lag where we're using data from 2000 to instrument density in 2010, but we're actually just going to use a measure at a higher level of aggregation. So it's the density of the subdistrict without that particular community. Yeah, so it's again, another instrument has a slightly different and weaker kind of exclusion restriction. This is our first stage relationship where we're regressing in column 1, we're regressing a bunch of different soil indicators on density, and column 2 is the built up density in 75 on density. Column 3 is the built up density, the sub-district density in 2000, and we're finding basically pretty large first stage F stats of these regressions that suggest that pretty strong well specified IVs. For our soil IVs, we actually have a bunch of different measures, so the F stats are falling because we're including more and more variables, but these are pretty good F stats. And I should mention that I'm using kind of a relatively new technique where we have a whole bunch of different possible characteristics, and I don't have a lot of theory about which of these characteristics matters the most for predicting density. So I'm kind of letting the data, and I'm using kind of lasso penalized regression. It's like kind of a machine learning prediction approach to sort of pick the best covariates in this first stage relationship. And so, yeah, so that's what we're doing for the kind of simultaneity problem. Let's talk a little bit about sorting. So we're going to kind of specify a sorting model for how people decide what communities that they live in. So basically the utility or the indirect utility that individual I gets from living in community C is going to be WI times AC minus PC plus epsilon IC. So AC is going to measure the amenities for community C. So those amenities could be, the trust, the kind of group cohesion. It could also measure other, omitted amenities. PC is going to be kind of housing prices in that community. And epsilon IC is going to be an idiosyncratic component. So it's going to be like a taste parameter that's specific to individual I for living in community C. So this could measure the strength of that individual's social networks in that community, or some omitted migration cost or something like that. The WI are going to be kind of preference parameters that are going to be given by a combination of 3 things. So there's going to be observable characteristics that that individual has that influence social capital. So maybe their education, their age, their gender. We're going to have omitted characteristics that influence social capital. So XIU, these are maybe things like how racially intolerant you are, how racially biased you are, or how free riding you are as an individual. So XIU is going to be this, and then QI is going to be other variables that could be both unobserved and observed that might impact sorting, but not social capital. So I don't have a good kind of intuition for something that would impact your sorting, but not your willingness to participate in your community. But I can imagine, maybe there's some variables that do that. And then households are going to choose a location maximizing utility, taking their amenities and PC as kind of given, and they're going to use kind of all available information to make their decisions. And so there's this paper by Altanji and Mansfield shows that under models that are basically set up like this, sorting is going to actually create 2 vector value mappings. There's going to be a mapping between, this is the average characteristics of the community for people that choose that community, the average observed characteristics, this is XC, is going to be a function of amenities, and the average unobserved characteristics is going to be a different function, FU of AC. So basically there's going to be a mapping between the amenities in that community and the observed average characteristics and the unobserved average characteristics. And what they show is that under relatively weak assumptions, we can actually invert these functions. So we can invert this F, so we get F inverse of X, sorry, this should be XC, but basically we can basically write X, X V of U, so the average of the omitted characteristics is a function of the observed characteristic, and under an additional assumption, this is actually linear. So what this basically means is that you just need to control for these XCs, this sort of average characteristics of the average demographic characteristics of the community, of people in the community, and other proxies for AC that are not mechanically kind of related to sorting to deal with sorting. And so the controls for observable neighborhood composition effectively eliminates sorting bias. So I'm going to use a vector of 37 characteristics that are measured from 2010 census data and a measure of neighborhood level characteristics that are basically not mechanically related to village composition in order to kind of control for sorting and estimating the effects of density and social capital. So what is this XC going to actually look like? So it's going to include the average age, average years of schooling, the percent of the neighborhood that's single, married, divorced, female, working in different sectors, the percent ever recently migrated or ever migrated, the percent that speaks Indonesian at home, and then the shares identifying with different religions and ethnicities. We check a sufficient condition for the invertibility of these functions in the sorting model is that the variance of XC is rank deficient, and we actually can check that in the data. We do that check. It looks pretty good. We also try to use measures of XC that are estimated from the 2012 census. So we use the community, the averages from the survey data to measure XC instead of measuring them from the census data. We are actually hoping that these survey-based measures would give us more variance and less precision, but we actually don't. It doesn't seem to matter which one we use, which is I think kind of interesting. And that sort of suggests some of the robustness of this technique. I think we also measure these sort of neighborhood level characteristics that are not mechanically related from sorting. These include natural amenities like elevation, ruggedness, the quality of infrastructure, so like water sources, power sources, mobile phones, TV signals, the existence of community empowerment programs, distance to different amenities like markets, schools, hospitals, and clinics. So these are all things that we're throwing into the regression to basically control for sorting. So our final model that we're going to estimate is going to be that the first regression specification that I showed you before, plus the addition of these sorting controls and these other neighborhood characteristics that are effectively proxies for these A's that are not mechanically related to sorting. So just some details. All estimates are going to include city-specific fixed effects. We're going to do that mean effects analysis where we form kind of outcome groupings for similar outcomes. We're going to be using this approach from Bologna, Cherno, Zukov, and Hansen that selects the best instruments from a large number of excludable soil characteristics. So it's this like lasso-based regression, it's a lasso-based first stage, and then second stage, error correction, and then robust standard errors like clustered at the sub-district level. So just our results. So what this is these are estimates of the effect of density and social capital on the average kind of trust in neighbors across those different indicators that I showed you, several slides ago. And we find that, increasing density is reducing trust in neighbors. But again, this is like unadjusted for sorting. When we add controls for other specific neighborhood characteristics that aren't related mechanically to sorting, and for our sorting controls, we actually get pretty similar, coefficients. We can't reject that these two coefficients are different. So we do a test where we test to see if these two are different, and we actually find that no differences. Basically, increasing density seems to be reducing trust, and moving in these communities. These results are very similar to the types of findings on social interactions and density that we see in U.S. cities, which is actually quite surprising and kind of interesting. And if to interpret these effect sizes, if we take an average neighborhood in a central business district and we move to an average suburb, we see it about 20 kilometers away. We see an increase in trust of about 0.8 to 0.13 standard deviations. This is actually, substantially larger than the effects of an additional year of schooling on average trust. Sorting controls don't seem to impact, the estimates or kind of weaken IV strength. And the effect sizes are pretty similar kind of across different IV specifications. When we look at the effects of density on community participation, we see similar, effects. Basically, in some cases we can reject, that these estimates are different from one another. But moving from a central business district to an average suburb increases community participation by about 0.1 to 0.15 standard deviations, which is larger than the effect of an extra year of schooling on average community participation. When we look at interethnic tolerance, so for 2 of our instruments, the effects are not robust to sorting controls. For our GHSL 1975 instruments, which again drops a large part of the sample, we're seeing actually that those effects are robust to sorting. So we're not sure. We're still kind of trying to figure out what to make of this. But basically, it seems like greater density is associated with greater intergroup tolerance, and so there's in the suburbs, there's less interethnic tolerance, but it seems like sorting is probably explaining some of these findings. Nevertheless, again, I think it's still really interesting. And I think from a political economy perspective, when you're thinking about the types of candidates that, a national a national political party might be running to try to maximize power in different elections, you might these sorts of results are I think tell you something about the types of candidates you may be wanting to send to different places, for example. So it's just and I think overall the general kind of political polarization may be a growing problem in Indonesia. So in terms of robustness, most of what I've showed you involves using kind of linear, we basically take the survey data and construct a linear index. We try kind of different nonlinear models as well, and we find that the effects are pretty robust to this sort of different choices, different formulations of the dependent variable. We looked at this exact same question using different data. So we everything I showed you was just based on the 2012 SUSANES. We looked at cross-sectional data from the Indonesian Family Life Survey, so the IFLS-4 wave in 2007 and the IFLS-5 wave in 2012. We find 2014. We find very similar effects. Surprisingly, just the point estimates are super close. And then we also try a 2-step approach that has been popularized by Jill Duranton and Philippe Combs to address sorting that uses panel data. I'm not going to go into that too much, and we basically get similar effect magnitudes, but the effects are less precise because we have smaller numbers of IFLS villages. So the Indonesian Family Life Survey is this sort of panel survey and it was only in 300 villages. So it's just a smaller set of villages to work with. But what's nice is you can track people over time and see how people living in different communities, are more or less willing to participate in their communities or greater trusting and things like that. In terms of mechanisms, the kind of Putnam, idea really is that, right, if you have less time to commute, then, if you're spending all your time commuting, that's time you're not spending kind of in your communities. And so the sort of bowling alone argument is that sprawl is going to, reduce community participation. We find ex ante that doesn't seem to be happening in Indonesia. There's greater participation in your communities in the suburbs. But actually the people that are married, that have less time, the married with children, the people that are more highly educated, that have higher values of their time, the higher income individuals that again have higher values of their time, and individuals who take private transportation modes to work, those people are the ones that in these low density communities, they're actually participating more strongly in their communities. And this really suggests that these sort of differential opportunity costs are not explaining these results. Instead, we see sort of city level socioeconomic factors are explaining these relationships. We've seen that basically in cities that are larger spatially, we're more rapidly sprawling, and cities with higher ethnic fractionalization, so more diverse cities and cities that have higher crime rates, the sort of effects of density and social capital is kind of magnified. And so we're continuing to kind of explore some of those results. So just to conclude, we kind of provide some new estimates of how density causally impacts social capital in Indonesian cities. There's relatively little quantitative work in this area for less developed countries, and I think that's our kind of contribution. It's one of the first kind of papers. I think we also add to the literature really is in terms of really doing a good job of addressing both the simultaneity problem, that density is not there are unobservables that could be influencing density at the community level that we need to be kind of worried about, and also sorting. We find that lower density communities have higher trust in neighbors, greater willingness to help neighbors, greater voluntary contribution to local public goods. We see some evidence that there might be lower interethnic tolerance in these lower dense communities, but those effects may be explained by sorting. And the effects seem to be better explained by city level socioeconomic factors and not by differences in individual opportunity costs. And then just to, finally, what we're working on now is kind of, we're wrapping up, so like what's the theory for what's going on here? I really think that in, dense areas and very dense places, one reason why you may have less trust in your neighbors is that, there's so many people that basically you're playing a lot of one-shot trust games where you're not seeing the same people over and over again. So you can't kind of, there's like less information about how willing people are to, kind of cooperate with you. And so what we're trying to do is we're using evolutionary game theory to kind of model the way that information affects willingness to kind of trust somebody, in kind of an investor-receiver game, and with multiple different groups. So I think we're pretty close. Actually, I don't have any results on the model today, but I think we're quite close there. And this is, I think, one of the first papers that I want to write on urban sprawl in Indonesia. Another paper I'm really interested in is the extent to which sprawl is affecting kind of the carbon intensity of living. So I think that's another kind of first order question that's quite interesting. Now that we have a lot of this, the data and the identification, more or less in check, we can try to understand, are people that are living in these sprawling communities, are they living in larger homes? Are they consuming more energy? And what is the extent of like the overall kind of environmental, what are the environmental consequences basically of this growing sprawl? And then just, trying to understand overall, like, is sprawl good or bad for the country, right? So, like the new housing that's being built in these cities is helping people access the labor markets that these cities are offering, and helping people, get jobs, and that's generally increasing, output and GDP, but that's coming at the expense of some of these, environmental costs. And so just trying to kind of quantify the costs and benefits, I think, is just like super first order important. So that's all I had, but yeah, thanks so much for the invitation.
Great, thank you. That was very interesting. I enjoyed that a lot. So let's dive into a few questions about the paper.
Yeah.
So one thing that came to mind when I read it and during your presentation is that there are sort of different ways that you can sort of conceive of density. And what I mean by that is we can think of sort of higher density as a city sprawls outward, you're making what were previously not dense places dense. Mm-hmm. But then there's also sort of the conceptualization of, like, sort of within the existing city, you can sort of increase an already dense place. So I'm wondering if we generally think that sort of preserving and boosting trust and social capital is good, then what's, in terms of like zoning or other sort of policy changes, how do we sort of balance the sprawl density trade-off? Do you try to direct more of your density sort of to the existing built-up urban environment? And does that end up preserving more social capital, or does the alternative do that?
Yeah, so I think that's a good question. So this one paper is just looking at one particular aspect of sprawl, which is sure. The social capital, community participation. I think if you're like policymakers trying to make some decisions about should they introduce growth controls to shape the spatial extent of cities, our city boundaries being drawn in an optimal way, there's all sorts of things that they need to trade off. So, first order things are kind of energy intensity of different homes and the pollution that the sort of energy uses are causing. Traffic and commuting. So, many of if you take a look at, something like Waze's traffic index of like across the world, I think in 2016, they came out with a report that like ranks, you know, a whole bunch of cities. And of the top 10 cities, something like 6 or 7 of the cities with the worst traffic in the world are in Indonesia.
Wow.
And I think that, like, you know, the sprawl that's taken place in many Indonesian cities is causing people to commute long distances. People are spending a massive amounts of time in traffic going to work, and you know they're driving vehicles, causing all kinds of traffic related air pollution. So that, you know, that's something that you want to, you know, obviously try to understand as well. So there seem to be, at least from the perspective of community cohesion, you know, trust and community participation, there seems to be some benefit of sprawl in the extent that that's increasing, you know, social capital. There may be an interethnic tolerance cost that might be, you know, like not, you know, so super causal. But you know, this is, I think, the first, like, this paper is like first of a series of papers I want to write on sprawl in Indonesia, to try to really get a handle on like the, you know, the welfare effects, and like, should cities be you know, curbing, you know, the like shaping, using policies to try to encourage more, you know, growth up,
Right.
and less sort of outward growth.
Okay. So what you mentioned there about like more people are commuting and that kind of thing actually segues nicely into something else I wanted to ask. In Indonesia, as these cities are sprawling outward, are these political boundaries also expanding, or are cities sort of outgrowing their actual sort of political limits, and how do you think some of the sort of coordinating challenges that come with that might be influencing some of these things like community participation, and would something like sort of larger regional governance structures, like what you see with like Guangdong province in China, or like the Ile-de-France around Paris, sort of coordinate these kind of activities? Would something like that, do you think, be beneficial for measures of trust and or participation?
Yeah, so you know, I guess it's interesting. So, you know, Indonesia's undergone, you know, a lot of sprawl in recent decades, but there's also been a proliferation of new governments in Indonesia. So, you know, Indonesia went from being one of the most like centralized, you know, kind of dictatorships in Southeast Asia, like in the, you know, the 1990s, superpower, like, you know, Suharto's New Order regime kind of ran the country with a very like tight fist, like very, you know, hierarchical policymaking, to a very decentralized country overnight, where like lots of national power was transferred into district and kind of regional governments. And actually, because of some policies that have been in place at the national level, like there's a policy like basically transfers from the central government to the district government. There's like a fixed like, each government gets a certain block grant, and the size of those block grants is changing a bit over time. But there's actually been incentives for the formation of new local governments. And so it's something, it's called the like blossoming, or like pemekaran. So I think like in the like early 1990s, there was something like roughly 200 different, you know, district governments, like kabupaten governments in Indonesia. And so these are, you know, below province, but above the sort of, you know, so like a city like Surabaya, it might be like a kota, like a district government. And, you know, by 2014, that number has increased to like 350, 400. It's just like massive growth of new governments.
Yeah.
And I haven't looked to see like to what extent the urban sprawl is correlated with the sort of proliferation of local governments. I mean, and I think, you know, like to the extent to which, like, you know, if sprawl is taking place in a way that's like being very haphazard for development, then that is going to encourage like a higher level government where sprawl is happening across these jurisdictions to sort of deal with some competing land use issues and encourage like and so the fact that we have multiple governments, is potentially even more problematic from a sprawl perspective. On the other hand, there's an argument in the literature that decentralized governments have better information about their populations and they can make better policies to better encourage maybe community participation and trust. But yeah, I mean, I think all really good questions. It's the relationship between decentralization and kind of planning type policies is not super. So I haven't seen a whole lot of work on this. There's a guy, Rukmana is the name. He's an Indonesian urban scholar, and I think she's done some work on urban planning that basically during the Suharto regime and afterwards, and just finds that at least in the Suharto regime, a lot of the spatial planning that's being done to sort of try to draw where people are living and what should land use look like. Most of the spatial plans were completely violated, and the development that took place was really to developers could do essentially what they wanted to, and particularly the developers that were really close to the crony capitalism at the heart of the Suharto regime. They benefited the most from these violations in these spatial plans, and the extent to which that has continued is a really open question. So
that's interesting. Another thing that came to mind while reading this, I thought of Singapore's ethnic integration policies, where particular neighborhood or block levels, I'm not sure if it goes down to the building level, but at least to the neighborhood and block level, there are specific requirements that at least a certain percentage of the population must be Malay or Indian or Chinese. I'm wondering how you think that a policy like that might relate to these findings. Would that work, or what would that do in an Indonesian context?
So it's interesting that you asked that. So my co-author on another project, Maisie Wong, has a really nice paper on ethnic quotas in Singapore and kind of the effects on and together actually we looked at we have another paper that's looked at Indonesia's transmigration program, where so the question is kind of like what should policymakers do about ethnic composition, and how should policymakers, should they have quotas that sort of require a certain amount of diversity in certain neighborhoods? Is that going to increase tolerance and social interactions? And I think our work in Indonesia, so there's a program called the Transmigration program, which is a program that moved millions of landless laborers from Java and Bali into the outer islands. This happened in the 1970s and the 1980s. And then once they moved to the outer islands, they're basically land markets are very sticky, and there's a lot of migration restrictions that from kind of sticky land markets and heavy migration costs that people are kind of stuck in these places. And some of the communities were very ethnically diverse, and some of them were in very polarized places where you had kind of a large share of one group and a large share of another group, so there's high polarization and there's high diversity villages. And so we actually kind of look at the effects of these different ethnic mixes on kind of social capital outcomes. So we don't look at social capital, we do look at some social capital outcomes. The main outcome that we look at is kind of the extent to which you buy into the Indonesian nation, the kind of extent to which you speak Indonesian at home. And we find in these places with low polarization and high fractionalization, so these places that are very diverse, but one two groups aren't dominating. There's like lots of small groups. That seems to increase kind of interethnic interethnic marriage. It's increasing, the adoption of the Indonesian kind of identity. It's increasing like measures of social capital. The places that are more polarized, where you have like 50-50, Javanese, non-Javanese, those places, are not cooperating with each other. They're not kind of buying into so the precise mix is like really important. But so those effects are from an agricultural context, so it's hard to extrapolate to. Sure. It's a particular population of like landless volunteer. Like these are kind of low-skill migrants, low education migrants that are willing to participate in this program to kind of get land in the outer islands and move away from people in Indonesia. So it's also a setting where you're shutting down migration. So and it seems like people are like, the fact that we see this, as distance increases and sorting is happening, people seem to be wanting to move to these ethnic enclaves. And so, like they value, kind of that homogeneity, and they value like forming a community in that homogeneity. And so like forcibly shutting people down from that, it's hard to know, like, I think it's, again, a really interesting question. And, I think it's something that I'd like to do some more work on in particular. But yeah, like, would Singapore's policies work, in every Indonesian city? I mean, Singapore also, like, there's no outside option, right? So like, if you're a Singapore national, like you're kind of stuck there. This is something that if Indonesia tried to implement, it would be very.
It's easy to work around.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, and you could, if you don't want to live in the city where this is implemented, you would just move to another city. And,
sure.
Yeah. So yeah. But I mean, it seems like, if you force people to interact in particular ways, they will get along with each other, and they'll learn, and they'll tolerate each other. But the thing is, people just they move and they want to do what they want to do.
Right. So you said this is a working paper. Where can folks find it, or when will it become available? And how can they reach you?
I'm hoping to release the paper the next 2-3 weeks. So on my website for sure, we'll hopefully be submitting it to a journal pretty soon. And I'm just cycling through my slides to find my email address is right there. So feel free to reach me if you have any questions.
All right. Thank you for joining us. This was great.
Yeah. Thanks so much. I appreciate it.